Warning, this podcast is meant to help you think outside of the box. Some of the topics may be triggering for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to another episode of the Consume Her Consumer podcast. This is your host, Anna, aka Mystic Pixie. I hope you have been having a wonderful week. I wasn't sure where I wanted to go because I've had so many topics come up over the last few weeks that just intrigued the shit out of me. And I just keep getting so excited about so many different things. But I figured since we have been talking old Hollywood and kind of the way that everything has been building over the years, and boy, some really weird things are happening in Hollywood right now, especially with some of the celebrities' faces. Now, I'm not picking, and I don't care if people do plastic surgery or anything like that, but it just, some of the celebrities are looking a little odd lately, I think, but just a weird little note of my own, and just an opinion, and it's worth nothing. But what I decided to do this one on is I am going to go back to some early to mid Hollywood, okay? And little out of the golden era into the 50s. And I want to talk about Bette Davis. Well, why? Because I had no idea about this, but Bette Davis was kind of a boss bitch. And again, as we've talked about the way media portrays people, I find this so fascinating. I was looking into this a little bit in her court case, and it came to me that I just feel like I need to talk about this one next. Now, this might not be the most exciting of the podcasts and whatnot, but maybe you'll like it. I don't know. We'll see. But let's go ahead and get started. So Bette Davis was born Ruth Elizabeth Davis, and she was born in 1908 in Massachusetts, and this girl was a trailblazer for American actresses. Now, some of her key qualities were she gave these intense performances. She was very sharply witty, and she refused to really conform to the Hollywood beauty standard. Now, a lot of people, well, especially even my husband, I had mentioned that this was going to be the next topic, and he's like, I know nothing other than there was a song, and he started singing, "She's got Bette Davis eyes," and I said, yeah, that's exactly where my brain went to. And so why not dive in and talk, because Bette Davis had a lot more going on other than a song that was written about her later. Now, her career really kind of got its start in 1929-ish, but her breakthrough role happened in 1934. And she kind of spanned through 1989, but she actually passed away in late 1989 in France. Now, she was nicknamed the Fourth Warner Brother, which I will get into heavily later. And she was also known as the First Lady of Film. Some of Betty's signature traits were known for playing a very sardonic or mocking, unsympathetic woman with just raw intensity. And they said she could be this master of transformation, both physically and emotionally. Now, this reminds me of my dad. Now, my dad's silent generation. He was born in 43-ish, so late silent generation, early boomer. And he would always say to us, you know, you guys have these movies and they put all these special effects in. And back whenever we went to the movies, they didn't have to do all these special effects. The actors and actresses were so good, you believed their acting skills. It all came out of raw talent. So this really it reminded me so much of my dad. But one of the things about Bette Davis was she was also fiercely combative with directors and the studios, and she is said to have been a perfectionist to the bone in her craft. She was known for a clipped vocal style, and she always had, I guess, an ever-present cigarette, and that became very iconic for Bette. So her breakthrough role was called Of Human Bondage, and that came out in 1934. And she played this very cruel and manipulative waitress in this toxic relationship. Now, critics hailed this breakthrough as raw and unglamorous and emotionally brutal. And this was rare for the era for female actresses. But another thing about this was, despite the rave reviews about her performance, the Oscar Academy completely snubbed her. She didn't even get a nomination for this. And there were some backlashes from the studio. They were trying to argue for write-in votes, but nothing really came to fruition on that. So she did not get any awards for this, but she was really celebrated for this opening breakthrough role. Now, during the golden era of Hollywood, Bette dominated the late 30s and early 40s. Okay, some of the known titles were Dark Victory, The Letter, and now Voyager, and also The Little Foxes. First woman to receive an AFI Lifetime Achievement Award, and she won Oscars for 2 roles for Best Actress, which I'll get into later. But she was later then, this was something I found really cool. So after the drama that I'm going to get into later, she ended up being a co-founder of what was called the Hollywood Canteen, and this was to support the World War II troops, okay? So during World War II era club, this was a World War II era club in Los Angeles, and they operated from October 3rd, 1942 to November 22nd, 1945. This was co-founded by Bette Davis and John Garfield, and this was to be a morale booster haven for these enlisted service members who were going to be shipped overseas. So this was free for all people in uniform. They would get admission, food, and entertainment, and it was completely free. Their uniform was actually their ticket in. And Bette and John would get these celebrity volunteers, so stars like Marlene Dietrich and Rita Hayworth and Shirley Temple and Roy Rogers, and they came and they would help serve food. They would dance and do performances, and then they would even go as far as helping by washing dishes, guys. How freaking cool was that? Now, this club was alcohol-free. This was strictly for sober fun, and anybody that would be found imbibing in alcohol, they would call the LAPD to come in and remove them. This had a massive impact because they hosted thousands of troops, offering joy and connection before their deployment, which, a lot of them didn't come back, right? So Bette called this one of her proudest accomplishments, and it wasn't just a club, it was this sacred space for service members, and it was a place for glamour and some solidarity, and it was just supposed to be a place of joy before people went out, before these service members went out and had to go into battle, into war. Now, one of the big things that Bette Davis was known for, let me start by saying this. When I get into this lawsuit, it is under her married name, okay? So this will be her, Ruth Elizabeth Nelson was her married name, and there was a lawsuit where Warner Brothers Pictures, Inc. sued Bette Davis, or Betty Nelson, and this was in 1937. So to take you back into 1936, the setup of everything was Bette Davis was under a contract with Warner Brothers, okay? And she gave the studio total control over her roles, which gave the studio total control over Betty's roles, okay? Now, Davis felt Warner Brothers was damaging her career, okay? This is all during 1936. And she felt this because she said they were forcing her into these mediocre films, and they were really going for a lot of films. And her contract bound her exclusively to Warner Brothers for 52 weeks, like I said, and it was renewable at Warner Brothers options. So they could just cut it at any time. Now, Bette wanted better scripts. Like I said, she was so picky about her performances. She was just a perfectionist. So she wanted quality. Now, she also wanted better directors to work with, and she wanted some artistic freedom in her acting. She was forbidden to work for anybody else under this contract, even if the roles were degrading or politically misaligned with her personal values. Okay? So frustrated by being cast in these mediocre pictures, she ended up fleeing to England to make films independently. This woman fucking went for it. Now, Warner Brothers ended up suing her in England, seeking an injunction to stop her from working elsewhere, and she was working outside of her contract, okay? And she was. Now, despite being barred from working for anyone else, she wanted to go out there and just pursue doing what she loved, how she loved doing it. So a couple of the things that came out of this was Bette Davis's lawyer argued that the contracts were very oppressive and they allowed Warner Brothers to suspend her without pay and force her into roles that she found distasteful. And Warner Brothers' lawyer, in turn, mocked Bette and said that her claim of, in quote, slavery, saying that it was $1,350 a week was hardly servitude. Now, just to kind of give you like an idea of what this money was at the time, in today's value, that was 1936. In today's time, this would have been $29,370-ish dollars. So it really was a lot of money. But later, Bette says this was not about the money. And let me get into that a little bit later. But why England? So she felt that she could try to go there and do this whole legal loophole. And the case ended up being heard in England then, because that's where she fled to break free from Warner Brothers and attempt to work independently. So Davis left Hollywood in 1936 and traveled to the UK, where she signed on to make 2 films with British producers Ludwig Blathner and William Scher. Warner Brothers was fucking pissed. So they went and they said she was violating her exclusive contract, and they sued her in the British court system to prevent her from continuing to work abroad, okay? Why not sue in the U.S.? Well, Warner Brothers had already said she violated this contract with Davis under the U.S. law, but since she was physically in England and trying to work there, they needed to enforce the contract under British jurisdictions to stop her from acting in these UK films, okay? Now, British courts had to decide whether to uphold a U.S. contract that restricted someone's ability to work in the UK. This is groundbreaking. Now, the case became a test of international contract enforcement, and it raised questions about restraint of trade and personal service contracts. Davis really hoped that the British courts would be more sympathetic towards her and see this as her trying to continue artistic freedom and also see her contract as being oppressive. The court ruled in the favor of Warner Brothers, though, and they stated that while the contract was strict, it wasn't illegal under British law, or it wasn't legal under even British law. She was barred from working in England for the duration of her Warner Brothers contract then. The British press offered little support, and they painted her as this overdramatic, disloyal little princess that was just being dramatic. Now, her artistic concerns were reframed as financial complaints, rather, and that's really how the press started making her feel and portraying her to the public. Now, again, through this podcast, I have been talking about media portrayals and how it shapes people's reality, or, their perception of what the reality is. Now, there's so much to come from this, though, guys. It gets so cool. Now, they also said that she was, her artistic concerns were reframed as financial complaints, and they were erasing this deeper issue that Bette had. And that was, her demanding respect in this male-dominated system. So, in essence, basically Davis took fight to England hoping for liberation, but Warner Brothers followed her there, and they won. Now, this case made her a legend and helped shift power dynamics in Hollywood forever, as it marked a turning point. Davis's bold stand made headlines worldwide. This case was known around the globe. Now, the High Court in London sided with Warner Brothers, as I said, and the judge ruled the contract valid and enforceable, and ruled Davis saying that she breached it, okay? And she did. But she was effectively forced to return to Hollywood and continue working under Warner Brothers until her contract was until it ended. And they granted a negative injunction. She couldn't work for anyone else, but they couldn't force her to act for Warner Brothers either, though, okay? So the judge noted that she was intelligent and resourceful and she wouldn't starve, but basically said, yeah, you'll be tempted to go back. You're going to be tempted to return. The case became a test of international contract enforcement, like I said, and it raised questions about restraint of trade and personal service contracts again. Now, Davis took fight, because Davis took fight in England like this and won, the case still made her a legend because, like I said, this helped this whole Hollywood being the number one soul, you're going to do what I tell you type behaviors, and it said fuck you to it. By 1939, Bette was one of Warner Brothers' most profitable stars. Okay, this was post-legal battle. 2 years post the legal battle, she ended up earning the nickname the Fifth Warner Brother. Now, in later interviews, Davis clarified that her fight really was not about money. I mentioned this a bit earlier, but it was about artistic integrity. And she just wanted better scripts and directors and believing that her quality of work would naturally lead to the financial success. And basically, she just wanted quality over quantity. She didn't want to crank out crap. She wanted to put her efforts into something that was going to sell because it was good. And I find that respectful myself. But though Davis lost this legal battle, she won in essence because her rebellion made her a symbol of artistic integrity and female autonomy, especially in a place that was completely male fucking dominated. Yes. Warner Brothers began offering her better roles then too. So in turn, they did start giving her a little bit better things, better roles. And this led to her second Oscar win post lawsuit. And she really brought an emotional realism to the screen that was so raw, unsentimental, and often unglamorous. And she played this difficult woman often in a place where women were basically put in there to just be submissive and controlled. She was very ambitious. She acted in a way that she could play off being bitter. She embraced aging. She acted manipulative in some of these roles, and she was just morally ambiguous. And she was just really a trailblazer for this artistic autonomy. And this was coming into the late 30s. That's huge. She helped redefine what was meant to be a leading lady. It wasn't about beauty. This was about being commanding. Now, she didn't hide her age or soften her edges. Her later roles leaned into this grotesque, sort of tragic or even monstrous kind of characters, despite Hollywood having that obsession with youth that we've already discussed in previous episodes. Now, something really interesting that I noticed was there was such a double-edged sword with a lot of this because when she demanded better scripts, she was called ungrateful, right? Even through the court systems, through the media. And she embraced aging, and that often had people labeling her as grotesque, sadly. And it was probably pretty tough for her to keep fucking pushing through that, despite being like, hey, ogre. I didn't call her that, but I mean, come on. But she won Oscars, and they would say that she was deserving when she won, but when she lost, they completely flipped on her and called her washed up. Davis just wasn't really fighting for herself, though. She was really challenging this whole studio system's grip on actors and actresses. And again, she ended up getting a better role, which was in her next film, Jezebel, post lawsuit, and she won her second Oscar for this. The aftermath of the lawsuit, though, like I said, she was mocked by the press at the time. Her lawyer actually called the contract slavery. And Warner Brothers, again, like I said, they mocked that terribly and said that hardly looked like servitude. But the fight changed her reputation. She was then seen as this more demanding actress that was looking for respect and not just some fucking pawn in the studio who was willing to blow anybody who, would give them a role. And that is huge. She also really embodied what many would call a crone, somebody who was more like wise and a little aged, somebody who embraced power and they were feared. And that was not a typical role that women would play back then. But she also played this sort of like mythical kind of trickster in times where she really would just subvert these beauty norms. She would kind of mock the system, and she survived really just by playing by her own rules. And fuck yeah, I love this. So, soon after Warner Brothers began giving her these stronger roles, like I said, 1938, she gets Jezebel, and she won this Oscar, and this cemented her as one of Hollywood's greatest. This role was a fucking lifelong achievement for her, right? Not just the only one, obviously, but this one, especially post-lawsuit that would have crippled so many more actors and actresses, didn't. Now, the moral of this whole story was Davis lost in court but won in her legacy. And that is beautiful. Her defiance cracked the fucking system. And she really set the stage for actors to demand more creative control then. So she had some roles in between, but there was later a time when she did the movie, this was 1950, called All About Eve. And this one is actually probably one of the most famous, and arguably a lot of people will say this was the most iconic role, okay? But the role was a masterstroke of metacasting, and Davis played Margot Channing, a celebrated but aging Broadway actress facing the slow creep of irrelevance as a younger, seemingly innocent fan who was named Eve Harrington. And Eve Harrington infiltrates Margot Channing's life and her career in this film. The thing about this is it really mirrored her life in real life, Betty's life in the real world. Margot's fear of aging and becoming replaced mirrored Davis's own career anxieties at the time. And this was happening so blatantly throughout Hollywood anyways, and even now. Now, one of her famous lines from All About Eve was, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night." And this became legendary. Now, Margot didn't just play a diva. She was also very vulnerable, witty, and then very, very intelligent. And Betty portrayed this with ease in this movie. So she actually also throughout her career had 10 Oscar nominations, and All About Eve was one of them. And then there was another one called Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And now this was 12 years after All About Eve in 1962. And I had mentioned earlier, she was the first female president of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts, and Sciences. Huge achievement. And a check on the list for women. But Betty and the film Jezebel in 1938, Betty's portrayal, I want to go back to this Jezebel role because this was right after the lawsuit, and there is so much symbolism in it. It is fucking amazing. Now, the reason I ended up looking up the world of Jezebel was my grandma grew up around this time, and she would use this phrase, especially if she was like talking about like a promiscuous, like, "Oh, that Jezebel," and I would jokingly use it all the time with her too. So she played Jolie Marsden, and Jolie was a defiant Southern belle who scandalized society by wearing this red dress to a ball where virgins were expected to wear white. Her pride and rebellion led to this romantic but social downfall. But she seeks redemption by the film's end, okay? The film was crafted as this consolation prize for Davis after losing the role of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, okay? I believe she was going for this role and she was not chosen. But she ended up winning an Oscar for Jezebel. Now, symbolically, Davis's Jolie channels this Jezebel archetype. And I wanted to go back and kind of look into it because the word Jezebel, like I said, it came up like my grandma would use it. And I just felt there was going to be this deeper meaning to it. And fuck yeah, there was. So in the Jezebel, there's this whole thing called this Jezebel curse, okay? And I started looking into that. And well, I didn't really like understand it. It was this weird, I don't know, like just some goofy things that you would hear throughout history and political. Like apparently there was these feminists that cite Jezebel allegedly, like they hired these Etsy witches to like curse political figures, like with these like zits and wardrobe malfunctions and like minor inconveniences. That part I'm not really like interested in. But I do like that basically this Jezebel is really, she's this kind of like scapegoated woman punished for power and sensuality. And Julie Marsden's red dress is this signal of rebellion, even shame, and a little reclamation, okay? Bette Davis's Julie as this glam oracle, she was defiant, then she was punished, but then she was redeemed, okay? Now, stick with me here. Going through this whole Jezebel curse, it's not like this single unified concept like I just mentioned with like the weird political stuff, but rather this layered culturally like evolving biblical lore is really what I found it to be. So in Christian demonology and feminine critique and even some pop culture myths. Now, the whole biblical Jezebel, just to kind of touch on this because gosh, there's such a cool kind of parallel here. But the biblical Jezebel was this Phoenician queen, and she was married to King Ahab of Israel. And she defied Yahweh's prophets, promoted Baal worship, and orchestrated political murders. And her legacy was a symbol of seduction and rebellion against the patriarchal religious norms. Her death, she was thrown from a window and eaten by dogs, and this was prophesied as divine punishment. Now, over time, Jezebel, in quotes, became shorthand for this morally unrestrained woman and often weaponized against powerful or sexually autonomous women, and probably why my grandma used it. But in the cinematic terms, Jezebel in 1938, Bette Davis's character was scandalized by this Southern society when she wore this red satin gown to what was called the Olympus Ball. And this was a space where unmarried women were expected to wear this virginal white. And this wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It was this symbolic slap to the patriarchal face, okay? And the dress was designed by Ori Kelly. And the red dress was so deliberate and was an act of rebellion, signaling Julie's refusal to conform. Now, here's something so fucking cool about this. The film was shot in black and white. So the red was described and dramatized rather than actually seen on screen. And Julie, the character's choice to wear red, is a narrative turning point. It leads to public shame. She knew this was coming. It was the collapse of her engagement then. It was called off. And then this sets her on a path towards redemption. Now, if we look at the modern spiritual circles, especially with some Christian traditions, the Jezebel spirit also is still, like I said, it was kind of described as like a manipulative, seductive, controlling force. It was often a female that was described as the Jezebel and associated with rebellion, vanity, sexual immorality, and deceitfulness. And it was believed to curse individuals or institutions by sowing division, false prophecy, and moral decay. Now, Bette Davis, she didn't just wear the red dress. She embodied it completely. She lost the role to Scarlett O'Hara, who also wore a red dress. So Jezebel was kind of her revenge vehicle. This film was rushed into production as a kind of like cinematic grudge match, which I found pretty interesting because Gone with the Wind is very, very famous. And her portrayal of Julie is raw. It's volatile and it's unapologetically feminine, but it channels this sacred bitch with survivor fucking magnetism. And the red dress, through the unseen color of the black and white screen, became one of the most iconic fashion moments in film history. How cool is that? So, like I said, Julie Marsden was kind of this Southern belle who gone rogue, and she went rogue, and Julie was expected to be demure and obedient, and she was supposed to wear this white gown to this ball, and basically all this did was provoke scandal locally, and it showed her defiance. And she manipulates, seduces, and provokes, especially the men around her. And the red dress is more of a dare. It wasn't a mistake. Now, she was punished for her rebellion in the movie. Julie was punished. Her fiancé leaves her. Society begins to shun her. And she was forced into this whole redemption era. And unlike biblical Jezebel, Julie ended up choosing to sacrifice. So In the end of the movie, no spoiler, I'm sorry, but spoiler alert. In the end of the movie, she nurses her ex during a plague, and she offers herself as a kind of penance. So really, this was about transformation rather than submission as far as this role went. And as far as Jezebel and Julie, these red-dressed rebels, both women defied patriarchal norms. One rebelled through religion and politics, and the other through fashion and emotion. But both were punished for their audacity of breaking these fucking norms. And they were vilified for it. Now, the red dress becomes a symbol of unapologetic femininity and emotional power and fucking rebellion. So Betty didn't just play Julie. She was the fucking red dress rebel of Hollywood. She lost this role of Scarlett O'Hara, like I said, so Jezebel was absolutely her revenge at the time. And she poured all of her fury, her elegance and defiance into the Julie character at the time. And her performance turned the red dress into this garment of survivor rage, feminine power, and emotional truth. Now, again, this was all about not conforming. And there was a patriarchal backlash against this autonomy, sexuality, and the spiritual authority. And she ended up becoming kind of a scapegoat and demonized to anybody who, and she was used to, as a scapegoat of societal norms. Now, all of this came after her lawsuit that she went after with fury and revenge. So it almost played out on screen via the movie. Awesome. Now, there's a couple other notable cases, and I don't want to get into them too heavily. I'm going to try to keep this episode shorter. But there was Olivia de Havilland in 1943. So this would have been not quite 10 years after Betty's lawsuit, but she also, Olivia successfully sued Warner Brothers. And this was another assistant in dismantling the studio system's control over actors and actresses. Now, there was also a couple other actors or actresses, Constance Bennett, Claudette Colbert, and Barbara Stanwyck. And they all negotiated non-exclusive contracts, profit shares, and worked with independent producers, which were like early freelancers in the male-dominated system. Now, a lot of these people were treated as commodities, and their beauty and youth were only, and their compliance were just monetized, like we've been talking through this whole podcast so far. And men were treated as the talent, and their skill and their charisma were rewarded with autonomy. Now, those cases all kind of helped with the reshaping of some of Hollywood. It's still kind of continued because, like I said in my very first actual episode that was not the About Me one, but the one where we talked about Alfred Hitchcock, they still did this whole beta sex kitten and, oppressing women through film and making them submissive and controlled. But again, during this time, this was fucking huge. So while Davis was vilified, male actors at the same time that were challenging studios received more sympathetic or strategic portrayals by the media. And a couple examples go with James Cagney in 1930s. He sued Warner Brothers for breach of contract, and he actually won. The media framed him, though, as this tough negotiator, and he was not a naughty boy. He was this master negotiator who had to fight. And he was praised for standing up to the studio system, and he was quickly rehired after winning too. Again, they did bring Betty back, but she was a moneymaker. She was a great actress. Now, Humphrey Bogart, he fought for better roles and better contract terms, and his resistance was also seen as like this masculine, cool-headed, sort of non-emotional rebellion in this kind of not irrational way. He was more rationalized, and they really showed him more or less scandalous and more like, look at his gritty independence. And then Ronald Colman sued Samuel Goldwyn for breach of contract. And the media coverage of Ronald focused on this whole legal precedent and the artistic integrity, which was the complete fucking opposite of how they treated Betty. And it didn't jab at his personal character as they did to Bette. So again, Betty's trial wasn't about legalities. It was about this archetypical welfare and giving women some fucking autonomy. She was cast as emotional and unruly and defiant to her masters, while men were just viewed as these strategic professionals. So again, this Julie Red Dress moment, this Jezebel moment, was an embodiment for this win. Now, a couple other cases that I looked into. Again, I didn't want to get too much into it, but Olivia de Havilland, when she ended up suing Warner Brothers over contract extensions that kept her bound beyond her original contracts, she ended up winning in 1944 and setting the de Havilland Law, which limited studio contracts to 7 calendar years. And I guess they just kept redoing her contracts and extending them, and it was constricting to her career. Her case had this massive impact where Bette cracked the door open. Olivia motherfucking kicked that door in. Now, Mae West, she fought with script control and censorship battles, and she ended up writing her own material, and she ended up she fought the production code censors constantly. I guess she was pretty combative. And she Paramount tried to rein her in, but she ended up wielding her own box office power like a weapon, and just said, fuck you, I'm your meal ticket, motherfucker. I mean, she didn't say that, but that's basically what she was saying. And Barbara Stanwyck, she ended up going for contractual independence. Now, she refused these long-term contracts with the studios. She ended up choosing to do freelance instead, which at the time was almost fucking unheard of. And it was a bold move. And she really fought for a lot of creative control with doing this. So she picked her own roles and collaborators, and then she awfully played these really morally complex women. And not everybody could do it because a lot of the people were going in there for youth and looks and the glam kind of roles. So I think these women are so fucking cool because they're really kind of that other end of what we've been talking about. But she really didn't sue. She just outmaneuvered. So go Barbara. And there was another, Myrna Loy. I thought she was pretty cool to talk about because she was a political advocate and she was really outspoken against racism and sexism in Hollywood at the time. And it really limited her roles. The studio pushed back. She was working with MGM and they often sidelined her for being too opinionated, but she would just keep poking that bear and she kept persisting. And she was known kind of like this diplomat warrior, and she was always fighting within the system for more like a wider, broader range of actors and actresses. Now, Anna May Wong. Now, this person was a Chinese American movie star who fought the racial barriers. She was denied leading roles often because she was only cast in stereotypes. And a lot of the time, she was really criticized because of Hollywood's racism and even left for Europe to find better roles as well. And she was really just silenced, but she endured it and she pushed and she left as well. So all of these women like Bette were navigating a system designed to control their image, labor, and voices. Some sued, some subverted, and some walked the fuck away. But all of them embodied resistance.